Today, my talk will be high-throughput calculations and machine learning for X-ray absorption spectroscopy. So this is a very interesting and a very exciting field. So during the past few years, our group has been working closely with the Berkeley lab to do a few works on generating the database as well as building machine learning models to sort of automatically characterize the XAS spectrum from the data. So the overview of this talk is as follows. In the beginning, I will give a short introduction of X-ray absorption spectroscopy, which I think is not necessarily needed for this audience, but to make the presentation more coherent, I decided to put it into this talk. And then I will go through the high throughput calculation workflow that we built to generate the largest database for the XAS and host the data on the materials project. And lastly, I will introduce a few works, including our own work on applying machine learning to the application of X-ray absorption spectroscopy. So the first slides will introduce how does the absorption occur. So basically, when you have a X-ray, and the X-ray will interact with the core electron of the elements, and such electron will be excited to lowest unoccupied states or continuum. So when you measure the outgoing X-ray from the sample, you will see a decline in the intensity. So the difference is actually represented by the X-ray absorption. And depending on the principal quantum number of the core electron that takes the energy, we will label the absorption H as the KH, LH, or MH. And the graph on the left shows our typical X-ray absorption fine structure. So depending on the energy range, people usually divide this spectrum into two regions. One is the XANES region. So it's basically the sharp increase in the absorption coefficient on the left, and the rest is called the EXAFS, so the extended X-ray fine structure. And so for the near edge region, that corresponded to the transition of the core electron to the unfilled bond states and nearly bonded states, and as well as the continuum. So the intensity of that region is actually very high, and that corresponds to information such as the oxidation states, a coordination chemistry, as well as the orbital occupancy. And if you go through the literature, you will most often see the EXAFS, or the extended X-ray fine structure, absorption fine structure. So that corresponds to the transition to the continuum, where your excited electron will interact with the neighbors. And from the interference, you will see, you will be able to extract information such as the radiant distribution function of the atoms. And for the XAS analysis, there is a very established protocol to get information from such a signal. And for example, by first converting the measured intensity to the absorption coefficients, and then you subtract the smooth pre-edge function. And afterwards, you identify the threshold for the energy, and as well as normalize the absorption coefficient from 0 to 1. And finally, after you have the k-weighted chi value, you can fit the equation listed here, and you can get the coordination number from the signal itself. However, for the XANES analysis, there is no such thing called the XANES equation. And but you may wonder why people are still interested in the XANES. Well, that's because for the XANES, as you see in the earlier slides as well as this slides, and the XANES signal is usually quite intense, and you can get a very high signal, and information such as the coordination environment and oxidation states are all contained and can be analyzed from the XANES spectrum. And currently, there are only a few qualitative analysis methods, such as you can compare your measured spectrum to some well-established compounds, and then you can know what this spectrum look like among all the reference spectrum. or you can, or in the case that your sample is made of several different components, then you can do a linear combination of the individual components, try to match your unknown compound. And if you have a lot of data, you can also do something like principal component analysis and try to deconvolve the individual component signal from the total signal. And there has been some approach to sort of realize the quantitative XANES analysis by leveraging the computational method. So basically, the assumption is that whenever you have a structure, I can calculate precisely the XANES spectrum from the structure. So once you have established this connection between the structure and your XANES, you can easily manipulate your structure and try to match the output XANES such that your output XANES will have identical value or very close value to the experimentally measured value. So under that scenario, you can assume that your obtained final structure is actually the structure that corresponds to your experiment. And as you see, that such method depends on the computational software and the precision of your computation to match with the experiments. So far, there are several approaches and codes you can use. For example, the DFT approach as well as the many-body approach. And there are tons of software that we can choose from this pool. And today, the software that I'm going to introduce is called the FEFF9 software. So why do we choose that one? Is because it's actually quite fast. And remember, the goal, our goal is actually to simulate all the materials that we have in the materials project. So that accounts for like more than 100,000 compounds. And we have to use a software that is relatively fast. And it has to be accurate, otherwise it's lost all the meaning, right? And lastly, it's also most importantly, the software has to be relatively parameter-free, because when you consider all the chemistries, you cannot really fine-tune the parameters for each of the species, right? You have to have some kind of robust setting that you can apply to all the elements or all the compounds. And for FEFF9, it's actually the perfect software that satisfies all the needs that we have. So the FEFF9 is actually based on the real space Green's function approach. It's capable of calculating all the spectroscopies involving the electronic excitation. For example, the very common XAS and XES, and we also have the X-ray Raman scattering and other that years spectrum calculations. And so this software is developed by John Reel, and I think he's also in the University of Washington. And so in his earlier work, he has shown that the FEFF9 software can reproduce both the XANES spectrum for the metals as well as for the non-metal case. So the way we approach this problem is that we want to build some kind of automatic workflow that we can use to calculate all the materials. So in order to do that, we have to be able to generate the input file for the calculation relatively automatically. And so the left graph shows what the input looks like. Basically, we have some headers and have some control cards where you specify what kind of calculations that you will have. Then there are some potentials and as well as the atom coordinates for the cluster. And once you have this one single input, you can invoke the FEFF executable in the same directory and then run the simulation. It's similar to how we run a VASP calculation. And so initially, we spent a lot of time trying to develop the interface to generate such inputs automatically. So the software we use is called the Python Materials Genomics, or Pymatgen for short. So Pymatgen is a powerful software to Python package to manipulate the structures as well as generate input for various calculation software, as well as like process the output of the calculation results. So the FEFF has been added to Pymatgen as one of the modules. Here I'm going to demonstrate the workflow of generating the FEFF input files. Basically, you start from a structure. Like here, I use a copper as example, and then you use the materials project XANES like input set, and you specify the absorbing atom is copper and the structure is the copper structure I just constructed, and then you can write the inputs to the current directory. So as you see that once I click write inputs, then all the files are generated. So the most important one should be the feff.imp. And the MP XANES datasets input sets basically has a minimum number of parameters that you need to fill in. So most of them are actually good by default. So that's why we emphasized before that the approach should be relatively parameter free, and that really brings a lot of benefits when you consider apply this method to all the materials that we have. And after running the FEF calculations, we can parse the data output from again using a Pymatgen interface. So as you can see on the right, when I plot the calculation results, I get a pretty good matching between the calculation and the experiment by just doing a minimum amount of script generation and calculation. So I do not even need to know how FEFF carry out the calculation beneath the Python scripts that I just showed. And once we can calculate one structure, we can bootstrap the calculation to thousands or even tens of thousands using the automatic workflow management system. So this is a sort of a package suite that is developed by the materials project. The one software is called Fireworks. Fireworks is basically the one that we use to manage the job execution. You start from one structure, then you can initialize many different calculation runs. And Pymatgen is the one that I just mentioned to generate the inputs as well as parsing the outputs. And atomate is like a instance the version of Fireworks. Basically, you have a set of workflow that you can just use directly out of box without considering which parameters that I should use. So atomate has all the pre-compiled set of parameters you can use. You can just run the calculation by invoking one command line. And so we also have this thing called a custodian. Custodian is a package that is able to automatically correct the errors from your simulations. For example, once when your calculation does not converge, then you have to manually change your input file and then rerun the simulation, right? So that's what the custodian does automatically. Basically, it will detect the error category and then correct your input files automatically and rerun the job for you. So with all this in mind, we can establish the Fireworks calculation workflow. So this is how the high throughput calculations are conducted, and with the automatic data parsing and storing. So you first define the workflow, and you can then serialize the workflow into a set of dictionaries, and then insert the workflow dictionary to a remote database. And your workers the workers can be a local computer or it can be a supercomputer center. The workers will be able to fetch the job from your launchpad and then run the jobs on their local machine. And so once the job are run, they will automatically insert the parsed data into some kind of database. So a firework here is just a series of atomic tasks to achieve one goal. For example, it can perform a calculation or parse the data and insert to the database. So that's pretty much the mechanism of how we run the high throughput calculations. As mentioned earlier, so atomate has all the pre-compiled parameters that we can use for the job generation. So for example, running the XAS calculation can be just running the single function in Python script. So here are there some setup for the high throughput workflow, which I think I can skip for now. And for those who are interested in running the calculations, later I will share the slides, and you can see, you can play around with the example and see how you can run the simulations yourself. So that's pretty much for the high throughput workflow. Any questions from the audience?
There we are. Sorry. While we wait for people to bring in a few questions, I have one. So you have this outstanding structure with hierarchy and control and error tolerance and all that. Can you say just a minute, and maybe this is what the second part of your talk will be about, is motivate why you want to calculate 10,000 XAFs or 100,000 XAFs? Okay. So as people who work in the field, you may already notice that there isn't too many XAS data out there. Basically hundreds of them perhaps. And there is really a need to have more data, because every time people go to the synchrotron source, they measure some compounds. They also need to measure some reference compounds, right? You have to sort of compare your unknown material to some known and established material in order to know what composition or what local environment for the unknown compound is. So our goal here is to establish a very large database for the XAS, such that next time when people have some unknown spectrum, they can just use our database as a reference instead of doing their own reference. And we also, once we have the database, we also have a multiple application that we can deploy based on this database. For example, we can develop models to sort of go directly from the spectrum into the model characterization results instead of doing like a case-by-case matching. Good. Okay, that makes sense. Rachita Rana, you have a question?
Yes. So my question is, do you run VASP calculations on the fly while you are running FEFF9, or do you have the calculations done beforehand?
Oh, the FEFF9 itself has some self-consistent field calculations. So, but it's based on the muffin-tin approximation. So it's a relatively cheap and less accurate way to run the simulation.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Blair, you have a question?
Hi, I'm just curious if you're using reciprocal space or real space for your XANES calculations?
Yeah, the XANES calculation is in the real space.
Okay, because yeah, the ones I was looking at materials project last night were all, when I downloaded the feff.inp, they all were using reciprocal space.
Really?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. But I remember when we tested the parameters, we for the EXAFS data, we actually tried the reciprocal space, but the results actually matches pretty well with the real space. So, yeah.
And one more question. I've been playing around simulating some XANES under pressure, and I noticed that you needed to use the set edge card because it was giving unrealistic edge shifts on the order of 10 eV. Have you noticed the need to use the set edge card, and do you know much about it? There's really no documentation in the...
Okay. Yeah, for our case, no, because our goal is to generate the data for all the materials. So we have not really considered a specific application. So about the edge shift is actually a known phenomenon in the FEFF calculation. So we in our calculation, we also see there's a few EVs of edge shift in the calculation results compared to the experiments. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, you should please continue to the next part of your talk.
Okay, great. So this is just a summary of what we did in the actually did in the final publication that we had for generating the database. So we start from the materials project, which by the time has more than 130,000 structures. Then for each of the structure, we select the absorbing elements from the structure and then calculate the Zen spectrum for each of the atom in the structure, each of the symmetrically unique sites in the structure. So note that the calculation is done on the set base, not a structural-wise calculation. And finally, we insert all the data into the XAS MongoDB database. So this work has been published on the scientific data leading by Professor Christine Pearson's group. So here I'm showing some of the example spectrum. Basically, you can see that for most of them, actually the matching between the calculation and experiments are pretty reasonable. And you can see since the materials project has a lot of polymorphs, for example, for aluminum oxides, you have many different structures. And you can see that Zen's calculation can help you to identify the polymorphs among all among the pool of the other polymorphs. And we also compare to compared to the traditional metals. For example, for the sodium KH, as you can see that there is a edge shift as we just discussed. So this is a really known issue for the FEF calculations. In fact, I actually think the edge shift is a very common phenomenon, even if you do a more accurate calculation, like an ocean calculation or the VASP calculation on those on the XAS spectrum. So here is an overview of the XASDb in the materials project. So wherever you log into the materials project and you go to the details of a material page, and if you can find the X3 absorption tag on the top, you can just click it and that will bring you to the XAS data section. And for example, this copper data, we can directly visualize the data on the website itself. You can also apply some Gaussian smoothing to the data. This is because the calculation was done in a 0K condition, and if you have an experiment that's measured at finite temperature, you will have some smoothing or smearing effect. So that smearing effect is not considered in the calculation itself, but we can add some Gaussian smoothing post the analysis. And currently, the database hosts more than 500,000 Zen spectrum. It's actually we claim it's by far the largest database, but it's all the computational data. And so in addition to the website access, we can also access the data from programmatically. For example, you can go to the materials project website and you can get the API keys. And once you have the API keys, you can use the Pymatgen to to download the data from your Python script. For example, downloading the copper Zen spectrum, it can be as easy as just one line of code. Then you can plot the data in your notebook or whatever source that you like. So this is a pretty convenient way to get the data, to do a quick visualization or do a quick comparison to your experimental data. So the first application of the database that we had was to try to match with the experimental Zens. So this actually answers Jared's question earlier. So the goal was to match with experimental Zens. So how do we do the matching? Basically, it depends. It actually relies on the similarity calculations. For each pair of spectrum, we can calculate an index or the similarity measure from this pair. And there are actually many different similarity metrics that we can choose. For example, the Pearson correlation or the Euclidean distance or the Euclidean similarities, things like that. And we also encountered an issue with respect to processing experimental data. We know that experimental data, they may have a different energy range. They may be sampled in a different energy grade. And the first thing we did was to interpolate all the spectra or the pair spectra into the same energy range and interval. And then we normalize the spectrum by several different kind of normalization method. And lastly, we can do some feature transformation. And for example, by applying a square root to the intensity of the data. So this was carried out because when you do the mathematical transformation to the data, you will likely emphasize some features over the others, and different function will emphasize different regions of the data. So we want to use this transformation to bring more variety to the data sets. And so finally, once we have the similarity and the normalization, we know that there are so many different combinations. And the way that we thought about was to combine all the combinations of similarity and the normalization. We developed the so-called Ensemble-Learned Spectra Identification algorithm. So the idea is quite simple. So when you have one chopstick, you can easily break it, right? But when you have lots of chopsticks, you cannot really break it with your bare hand. So the idea of the ensemble method was that when you have one workflow, like you choose one specific similarity and one normalization method, and one transformation, you can easily miss some of the important features. But however, if you combine all of them, it's likely that you will have a stronger predictor than a single predictor. So, okay, once we establish this method on the computational data, we just test the model from using a few of the experimental spectra that we collected from literature. And we can see that the spectral matching method using the algorithm as well as the computational database can achieve 84% accuracy in identified oxidation states and about 79% accuracy in correctly identified coordination number. And what's more interesting and more useful is that we also deployed the application to the materials project website. Now you can try and play with it on the materials project website. It's called the XAS Matcher. You can upload the data and it will upload your own experimental data, and the website will try to find the best matching spectrum from the pool, from our huge database, and try to make the suggestion of what kind of data that you are having and what kind of a compound that you are having. So any questions for this part?
One question, the ELSIE method, that's really fascinating. In that study, was there any comparison done between the ensemble learning as opposed to learning based on individual similarity measures? Was it shown to be superior?
Yes, it was shown to be superior, but we did not really show it in the paper. So the ensemble method is basically based on the majority voting. So when you have we can for each of the learner, we can propose a list of compounds that are most similar to the unknown common, right? We can rank them by probability, and once we have 10 different learners, we can combine all the votings and then select the top ones that are consistently voted as the top spectrum that most resemble the unknown spectrum. It consistently beats the single learner from our study.
Okay, thank you. I don't think we have another pending question right now, so you should continue and we'll have more questions at the end.
Yeah, cool. So next, other than, because the similarity measure, it has some limitations. Every time you have to search through the database to get your most likely spectrum. It's more like a non-parametric model, which does not really scale with the data size. So that brings us to the question: can we really construct a more parametric model that we train the model once, and then the model can be used independent of the database forever? So there are actually a few very interesting pioneering work. For example, this one by Timoshenko, and he was actually one of the pioneers in this field, trying to use machine learning to predict the local environment from the spectrum. I think he was also one of the earlier speaker in the at the journal club. And so the first of his work, he used the platinum spectra and then predict the number of neighbors in different shells. And that one has really very interesting, very inspiring results. And then we have some classification of atom local environments from XANES. So basically, once we have the XANES, we can just have some classification machine learning algorithm to predict whether this correspond to an atom in a tetrahedron environment or in an octahedron environment. So this work has been done for using the XASDb on all the elements, the first row transition metals. Very interesting work by Carbon. And there is also other work that are specifically targeted on the specific application. For example, this work by Maria Chen's group, they are interested in knowing the oxygen environment from the XANES measurement. So basically what they find is that when you have a different oxygen environment, for example, the oxygen is surrounded by a different number of lithium, different number of iron, you can have different XANES spectrum. And the goal was to predict the number of neighbors, number of ions in the neighbor by using the spectrum alone. And it's actually a very interesting work. And instead of using just the spectrum as the input, there are also work that use the non-energy space as the input. For example, this work from the Toyota Research Institute, they divide the spectrum into a series of domains. And for each of the domain, they fit a polynomial function to it. And they can extract the polynomial coefficient as the descriptors and combine them together to form the inputs for the model. And subsequently, they use the random forest model to sort of make the prediction based on the fitted coefficient instead of the intensity. So I think one advantage here is that maybe the intensity itself is very sensitive to noise, but once you do some fitting, that will sort of reduce noise level to some extent. This is also similar to the idea of using a Fourier transform signal to make the prediction. So all the work that I just mentioned, they are they are in a inverse approach. Basically, you have the spectrum first, and then you predict the local environment from the spectrum. And there is also work that people do it in a forward fashion. For example, when they have a structure, they're trying to use the structure to predict the XANES spectrum from the structure. So bypassing the need to do the calculation using DFT. So this work by Carbon and collaborators published in the Physical Review Letters, they basically use a graph convolutional neural network, or the message passing neural networks, and to predict the spectrum from the structure itself. So all those are very interesting work. So I'm gonna also introduce some of our own work in this field. So this work is, in this work, we use a random forest model to predict the local environment from the XANES. So one of the problems that we encounter first is that how do we determine and define the local environment? We know that in a crystal structure, there are so many different local environments. You cannot really classify the local environment pretty easily. Like you classify it as an octahedra or tetrahedra. In reality, the situations are much more complex. You have many different choices. And the algorithm that we use to calculate the local environment labels is based on the work published in 2017. So basically, in that work, you can compare. You can first extract the local environment using some kind of Voronoi tessellation, and then you can compare your local environments to the different motifs, and you calculate a similarity score based on a similarity score with respect to many different choices of motifs. And depending on the similarity score, you can know that, okay, this environment is 80% octahedral or 20% tetrahedral. So this that's represented as a continuous number instead of like a binary label. So that's quite an innovation here. For example, like I show on the right, you can see that the local environment will change continuously from an octahedral environment to a square pyramidal environment. So the idea is to use a continuous number as the local environment representation. So this is the algorithm that they use. So as I just mentioned earlier, you extract the local environment, and then you for this local environment you compare it to a set of well-established motifs, and you calculate the similarity score, a continuous value from this matching. Fortunately, the matminer package has already included all the calculations methods. So whenever you have a structure, you can use the crystal nearest neighbor fingerprint methods to calculate all the parameters. For example, this one is a lithium oxide. For the lithium oxide, we can calculate the environments as for each of the elements in the system, each of the atom in the system, and then we can know that the local environment distribution as well as the weights that the algorithm assign to each of the local environments. So our machine learning model is inspired by this local environment assignment using a continuous number. So from the database, we can calculate the coordination number for each of the atom. And the coordination number is again not a binary value, but rather a continuous value, because whenever you have some distortion, that will make your local environment deviate from a perfect structure. So that's why introduce some fractional values of coordination number to some coordination numbers, and afterwards we can match the local environment to some coordination motifs like tetrahedral, octahedral, or cubic kind of a local environment. Again, at that point, you can also have a continuous value. And once we calculate the full description of the local environment, we can use some threshold to filter out those non-important local environments and only use the dominant local environment as the labels. For example, in the graph I showed, this structure has the first atom of this structure has the coordination number of 12, or it also has the probability or non-negligible probability of coordination number of 2. And then for the ranking labels, we can have a few choices, like ranked by the probability. And once we have generalized all the labels, the target labels, we can start our machine learning algorithm construction. So here I'm comparing our random forest model with other machine learning models. For example, the k-nearest neighbors, the CNN model, the multi-layer perception model, or the support vector machine classifier. You can see that the random forest model consistently beat all the other competitors. We also have the observation that with the more diversity in the elements, local environmental labels, it's more difficult to make the prediction. For example, as you can see in the figure D, the potassium is in the data set. The potassium has a very rich local environment. You can have many different choices of local environments. So that's why we have a relatively low accuracy. But for like many transition methods, you know, the transition metals, many of them actually only have octahedral environments. So in that case, the classification accuracy is really high, and the level of entropy is really low. So that's actually expected. And we compare the results also with the baseline accuracy. So the baseline accuracy is just predicting the majority labels for the elements in the database. For example, the scandium case here, since in the scandium, in the data set, scandium have more, almost 90% of scandium has the octahedral environment. So if you predict all the scandium to be octahedral environments, then you get automatically 89% accuracy. So that's really not very meaningful by talking about the accuracy itself alone. So you have to compare your model with the baseline accuracy. So we can see that in our case, we are able to consistently beat the baseline accuracy by some margin, especially for the late transition metals like the copper and zinc. And this model is relatively useful. And we also noticed that for the alkaline elements, the overall accuracy is really low. Okay, again, similar to the previous spectrum matching method, we apply the method to the experimental spectrum with non-compound structure. And the accuracy that we are able to achieve is about 81.5%. So we have also deployed the application to a web app. You can access the web app at the xas.crystals.ai. So again, that's works similar to what we have in the XAS matching app. Basically, you upload the spectrum, then it will be able, the website will be able to tell you what local environments that the spectrum most likely correspond to by within like 1 second or so. So that's all for my talk. Basically, I'm trying to, I hope these messages are delivered to you. So first is quantitative XANES analysis can be enabled by high throughput calculations and machine learning approaches. Currently, this approach is very relies on the accuracy of your simulation results. So in the future, we foresee that further improvement to the database will be needed to increase the accuracy. And lastly, we know that the experimental feedback has been limited in the high throughput context. And we have been trying to work with some experiments to try to raise the amount as well as the quality of the experimental data in this field. And hopefully we'll be able to have a combined computational and experimental database in the future. So yeah, that's all for my talk. I would like to thank the Materials Virtual Lab led by Dr. Xueping Ang, as well as Dr. Alan Deuser and John Rio from, and Dr. Joshua Katz and John Vincent, the audience here, for their input to the series of work, as well as Professor Jordi Cabana for providing some of the experimental database. I would like to also acknowledge the funding source from National Science Foundation as well as the LSDI. Thank you.
That was really interesting. Let's start off. There was a question posted very early on that unfortunately I missed. Matt Nouveau, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Chi. Lots of good stuff there. But I have a few questions. First is, how does the material where Pymatgen or this process handle non-crystalline materials?
Non-crystalline materials, in principle, that can be handled the same way as the crystalline material. So in Pymatgen, basically, what it does is that for any structure, you just take the local environment, because the FEFF calculation already requires you to have an atom cluster. So for non-crystalline material, you can do the same, and you can just extract the local environment for the one atom, and then you input the atom coordinates into the calculations So the simulation could run as the crystalline material with no problem. But we haven't tested whether the calculation results will make a lot of sense compared to experiments. Yeah.
Right. No, I understand that FEFF works with non-crystal materials. The question was whether this interface was doing non-crystal or non-perfectly symmetric. A related question is how do you handle the cases where there are more than one absorbing site for an absorbing atom in the material?
Okay. So currently we just do the set averaging based averaged by weighted by the multiplicity of the sites. So for example, when you have two ion sites that is in one local environment and the two ion sites in the other local environment, we just average them together and to get the final spectrum for the structure. That's actually the spectrum that you will get when you do a Pymatgen programmatically downloading of the spectrum. You will get the structure-wise spectrum.
Okay. Okay. I guess I will accept that. And I'm a little. I have to say that you said that the experiments, the agreement with experiment all looked good, and I didn't see that being the case in all of the spectra you showed, possibly most. How do you really qualify? What are you qualifying as good? You had these metrics. Mm-hmm. What are those metrics applied to? So just to be clear, XANES spectra starts off at 0 and it goes to 1, right? So it's a step. Do you remove the step in your analysis, or do you include that? Because that's obviously the fact that it steps from 0 to 1 is the biggest portion of the data. Are you including that in your 80% agreement, or are you taking out the obvious in your analysis?
I think that the 80% is the prediction accuracy. It's not the similarity score between the two spectrum. I agree with you. When you calculate the similarity score between two spectrum, then the step from 0 to 1 will dominate your similarity score, right? But the number that I showed is the prediction accuracy. It's in terms of getting the correct spectrum, getting the correct compound from the spectrum. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Similar but different question from Yang Ha about doing molecular systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have actually two questions. Number one is the input structure. So for molecules, I imagine you can easily convert a molecule to a graph, then you feed that to your CNN. But I could imagine it's harder if your structure is like a solid, right? That has the periodic boundary condition or these kind of things. So do they fall into actually two categories, or you actually have a unified model for all of them?
Actually, that's my research is on. We build the graph models for both crystals and molecules. So when you have crystals, basically you will have a virtually self-interacting atoms, right? You have a periodic boundary, and this atom will likely see its images. But when you build the graph, basically you can just treat it like a local graph. So one atom is only able to see the local environment, and this local environment can be the atom itself under a periodic boundary shift. I can send you our recent paper on this graph approach, but it's more like a separate topic.
All right, yeah, I'd love to see that. And my another question is about the big data, because we all live in the big data era, and sometimes we call it big data, but it's not for those like a Google or Facebook companies. So I'm asking, since you call this a high throughput calculations, so what's the magnitude, or like how much data can you produce using this method? And is it enough for some like complicated neural network training? So
I think for the XAS, currently our data size is on the order of 1 million. So you will say it's not as big as the billion of data that Google has, but for scientific data, it's actually a very huge database. And in the science field, we have to work on a relatively small data, right? So many of the times we may have only hundreds of data. For example, for the experimental things, we only have hundreds of data. So we have to
actually
devise,
that's the limit to limit the like application of machine learning in the field.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So we have to think creatively. How do we use the limited amount of data to make the most out of it? There are some methods that we can use. It's not a neural network kind of model, but rather we can use something like a Gaussian process, things like that, to do a local optimization instead of searching the whole chemical space. That's not, I don't think that's possible for now.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, Adam Clark, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the great talk. This kind of really follows on rather well, I think, from the previous two sets of questions. So typically I deal with quick scanning XAS where we do a lot of operando chemistry. And in such experiments, we can actually be collecting millions of spectra in a few days.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
Exactly. So how would you see these sort of methods applying to real operando chemistry experiments where you can have dynamic structural changes? And can you then identify, for instance, as a follow-on part, if you have different local environments present during any one part of the experiment, can you deconvolve these local environments to imply useful information on actual chemical processes?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, in some sense, the data you're just describing should be easier for machine learning or any kind of model, because in that case, you may have a relatively smaller chemical space, but for each of the chemical space, you have tons of data. So that's the situation that your machine learning model loves the most. So what I just showed is more like we have a vast chemical space because we include all the elements, but for each of the elements, we may have a relatively small data. So that's not something machine learning model likes. So I would be very interested to know further of how the data that you have. Maybe we can talk offline, or you can talk to Xueping sometime. We can set up a meeting also.
I'd be very happy to do that, actually, because it's an area we want to push towards understanding these systems a lot more, where, for instance, standard compounds do not explain the data very well.
Yeah.
It'd be wonderful to do that.
Yeah, nice.
Tim Hyde, you have a question?
Hi, thanks again, G, for the presentation. You've shown lots of capability in this presentation, but what wasn't so clear to me is what, in your opinion, has been your single most important result that you've attained in generating new structural knowledge from such a large database / effort that you put in.
Yeah, I think our goal is to help experiments to go directly from the spectrum to the coordination environments, or to identify the compounds. I think that's the most value that we bring to the table, and that hopefully that's something people will acknowledge in the future. But so far we just focus on building our set of tools, and we try to, like I just said, whenever experimentalist has some data or they have some problem to solve, we're very happy to work with them. Yeah.
So sort of people come back to you and say, hey, I've used this and it's helped me to determine a unexpected or unusual coordination geometry or something like this, and sort of you co-published or
yeah, they can also do. They can also use, because everything is public, right? All the data and all the code base are all public. They can also choose to do their own work. So that's up to them. Right?
Okay, cheers.